My husband Douglas walked out on me for his 25-year-old assistant Jenny, smugly telling me I was too ordinary for his success. But what he didn't know was that I had just discovered his secret $2.3 million debt and a web of lies that would destroy everything he thought he'd built. By the time I was done with him, Jenny would learn exactly what kind of man she'd really fallen for, and Douglas would discover that ordinary women can be extraordinarily dangerous when betrayed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember the exact moment my perfect life shattered into 1,000 pieces. It was a Tuesday evening in October, the kind of crisp autumn night that used to make me feel grateful for everything I had. I was standing in our marble kitchen, the one Douglas had insisted we needed to project success, stirring a pot of his favorite beef stew. The warm, savory smell filled our penthouse apartment, and I was actually humming as I worked. How naive I was. My name is Rose Whitmore, and until 6 months ago, I thought I was living the American dream. I was married to Douglas Whitmore, a charismatic real estate mogul who seemed to have the golden touch with every property deal he made. We lived in a stunning penthouse overlooking the city, drove matching luxury cars, and spent our weekends at exclusive country clubs where Douglas networked with other successful businessmen. I had given up my career as a forensic accountant when Douglas and I got married 3 years earlier. "Rosie," he'd said with that charming smile that had first captured my heart, "you don't need to work anymore. I make enough for both of us. Focus on being my wife, on supporting my dreams. That's what successful couples do." Looking back, I can see how perfectly he manipulated me, how he isolated me from my professional skills, my independence, my own identity. But at the time, I felt cherished, protected, special. Douglas was 12 years older than me, and he had this way of making me feel like I was the most important thing in his world. For 3 years, I played the role perfectly. I was the ideal corporate wife, elegant at dinner parties, charming, at business events, always supportive, never questioning. I managed our social calendar, decorated our home to impress his clients, and made sure Douglas always looked successful and well cared for. I should have noticed the changes earlier. The way Douglas started working later and later, the mysterious phone calls he'd take in private, the new energy in his step when he talked about his brilliant new assistant who was revolutionizing his business approach. Jenny Martinez had started working for Douglas 6 months before that terrible Tuesday night. Fresh out of business, school, she was everything I wasn't: young, ambitious, hungry for success. Douglas couldn't stop talking about her innovative ideas, her fresh perspective, her intuitive understanding of the market. "She's got this amazing ability to connect with younger clients," he'd tell me over dinner, his eyes lighting up in a way they hadn't when he looked at me in months. "She brings this energy to the office that's just infectious. Everyone loves her." I tried to be supportive. I tried to ignore the knot in my stomach when he mentioned her name. I told myself I was being silly, jealous for no reason. After all, Douglas had always been passionate about his work. It made sense that he'd be excited about an assistant who was helping his business grow, but the signs were all there, weren't they? The way he started dressing differently, paying more attention to his appearance, the expensive cologne he suddenly began wearing, the gym membership he'd purchased, claiming he needed to stay competitive in a young man's game. The business trips became more frequent, too. Douglas was always flying to check on properties, to meet with investors, to close deals. But now Jenny was going with him. "She needs to learn the business from the ground up," he'd explain. "Hands-on experience is the only way to really understand real estate." I remember the night I suggested joining him on one of these trips. We were getting ready for bed, and Douglas was packing for what he said was a crucial meeting in Miami. Maybe I could come with you this time, I said carefully, watching his reflection in the mirror as he folded his shirts. We haven't had a real vacation in so long, and Miami sounds lovely. The look that flashed across his face was pure panic, quickly covered by irritation. Rose, this is business. Important business. I can't have distractions. Distractions. That's what I had become. But still, I trusted him. Still, I believed in our marriage, in the life we'd built together. Even when the evidence was staring me in the face, I chose love over suspicion. I chose faith over doubt. What a fool I was. The Tuesday night everything changed started like any other. Douglas came home around 7, which was actually early for him lately. He seemed agitated, distracted, barely touching the dinner I'd spent hours preparing. Everything okay? I asked, reaching across the table to touch his hand. He pulled away, not meeting my eyes. Just thinking about some business decisions. Nothing you'd understand. There it was again, that casual dismissal, the implication that I was too simple to comprehend his complex world. It stung, but I swallowed the hurt like I always did. After dinner, Douglas disappeared into his home office, claiming he had important calls to make. I cleaned up, took a bath, and settled into bed with a book, expecting him to join me eventually. But he never came to bed. At 3 a.m, I woke up to find his side still empty. I padded downstairs and found him in his office. Still, fully dressed, staring at his computer screen with an expression I'd never seen before. A mixture of fear and desperation that made my blood run cold. "Douglas?" I whispered from the doorway. "Are you coming to bed?" He spun around, quickly closing whatever he'd been looking at. "Jesus, Rose, you scared me. Don't sneak up on me like that." I wasn't sneaking. I was worried about you. You look terrible. For a moment, his mask slipped completely. I saw something raw and vulnerable in his eyes, something that looked almost like guilt. But then he straightened, his expression hardening. "I'm fine. Just some complicated deals to sort out. You wouldn't understand the pressure I'm under." I stood there in my silk nightgown, looking at this man I'd loved and supported and sacrificed for, and I felt the first real crack in my faith. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. But I couldn't have imagined just how wrong things really were. Within 24 hours, my entire world would collapse. I would discover that the man I'd trusted with my heart, my future, my very identity, had been living a lie so elaborate and so devastating that it would shake me to my core. But I would also discover something else. Something Douglas had clearly forgotten in his arrogance and dismissal. I hadn't always been just a supportive wife. I had been a forensic accountant, and a damn good one. And once I started digging into the truth of our finances, our life, our marriage, there would be no hiding from what I found. Douglas was about to learn that underestimating your wife can be the most expensive mistake a man ever makes. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Douglas had eventually come to bed sometime before dawn, and when I woke at 7, he was already gone. No goodbye, no note, just the lingering scent of his expensive cologne and the impression of his body on the sheets. This had become our routine. Over the past few months, though, I hadn't fully acknowledged it until that moment. I would wake alone, spend my days managing our perfect home, and wait for a husband who seemed increasingly like a stranger sharing my bed. I made coffee in our state-of-the-art kitchen, the one featured in Architectural Digest 2 years ago, when Douglas was riding high on a particularly successful development deal. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating our carefully curated life. The designer furniture, the original artwork Douglas insisted we needed for credibility. The fresh flowers I arranged weekly because successful men's wives pay attention to details. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as Douglas had orchestrated it to be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But perfection, I was beginning to realize, could be the most sophisticated mask of all. I poured myself coffee from the Italian espresso machine Douglas had bought after closing a $1 million commercial property sale. As I sipped the perfectly brewed coffee from a cup that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, I found myself really looking at our life for the first time in months. The penthouse we lived in was stunning. No doubt about it. 42nd floor of the most exclusive building in the financial district, with panoramic views of the city skyline. But we didn't own it. Douglas had explained it was a long-term lease, better for tax purposes, more flexibility for a growing business. At the time, it had sounded sophisticated, strategic. Now I wondered what else might be more complicated than it appeared. Our cars were beautiful too, matching Mercedes sedans, his in charcoal, mine in pearl white. Douglas had insisted on leasing them rather than buying. Successful people leverage assets, he'd explained. Only middle-class thinking leads to tying up capital in depreciating assets. I had been impressed by his business acumen then. Now I wondered if there was capital to tie up at all. The art on our walls, the designer furniture, even my clothes. Douglas had very specific ideas about how everything should look. Image is everything in real estate, he'd say. Clients need to trust that you know value, that you understand. Quality, our home is our biggest sales tool. I had felt special being part of his success story. I had felt chosen, elevated, transformed from a practical forensic accountant into something more glamorous. The wife of a successful entrepreneur. A woman who could hold her own at charity galas and business dinners. But standing there that Wednesday morning, coffee growing cold in my hands, I began to see our perfect life differently. Had I been an accessory? A prop in Douglas's carefully constructed image? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces began forming an uncomfortable pattern. When we'd first gotten married, I had been excited to combine our finances, to build a shared future. But Douglas had other ideas. I've got a complex business structure, he'd explained. Multiple LLCs, investment accounts, business partnerships. It's easier if I handle all the financial management. You'd just find it boring anyway. At the time, I'd been touched that he wanted to spare me the mundane details. Now I realized he'd systematically excluded me from any real understanding of our financial situation. I thought about the dinner parties we hosted, the business events we attended. Douglas was always the center of attention, regaling potential clients and partners with stories of his latest deals, his market insights, his vision for the future. I had watched him work rooms like a maestro conducting an orchestra, and I'd been proud to be on his arm. But I'd also noticed how vague he could be when pressed for specifics, how he'd deflect detailed questions with charm and humor, how he'd change the subject when conversations got too deep into actual numbers or timelines. You have to understand, he'd once told me when I asked why he never brought contracts home to review. In my business, confidentiality is everything. Clients trust me to keep their information secure. I can't risk any leaks, even accidental ones. It had sounded reasonable, professional, impressive even. Douglas was so successful, so respected, so trusted with important deals. I had felt lucky to be married to someone so accomplished. But now I wondered, what exactly was he hiding under the guise of professional discretion? My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Lillian, who lived across the country but called regularly to check. Coffee date this weekend? I'll be in town for a conference. I stared at the message, realizing with a start that I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen Lillian. Douglas's social calendar had become our social calendar, and somehow my own. Relationships had quietly faded into the background. When had that happened? When had I stopped being Rose the person and become Rose the accessory? I thought about my old life, my old job, my old independence. I had been good at my work, really good. Forensic accounting required a specific kind of mind, one that could spot patterns in financial data that others missed, one that could trace the threads of complex transactions and find the truth hidden in spreadsheets and ledgers. Douglas had convinced me I didn't need that anymore. "You're too smart for that corporate grind," he'd said. "You deserve better than spending your life buried in other people's boring financial problems." But I had loved solving those puzzles. I had taken pride in my ability to uncover financial irregularities, to trace hidden assets, to follow the money trail wherever it led. It wasn't boring to me. It was fascinating, challenging, intellectually stimulating in a way that arranging flowers and planning dinner parties never could be. Why had I given that up so easily? The answer was uncomfortable but obvious. Because Douglas had made me feel like being his wife was more valuable than being myself. As I stood in our perfect kitchen, surrounded by our perfect things, in our perfect home, I felt the full weight of what I had sacrificed. Not just my career, but my identity, my independence, my sense of purpose. And for what? For a marriage that felt increasingly hollow, with a man who seemed to value me primarily for how well I fit into his image of success. The worst part was that I had been grateful. I had felt chosen, elevated, rescued from an ordinary life, and transformed into something special. But ordinary, I was beginning to realize, might have been better than this beautiful, empty perfection. I spent that Wednesday morning doing what I always did, maintaining the illusion of our perfect life. I called the housekeeper to schedule deep cleaning for our upcoming dinner party. I confirmed our reservation at Le Jardin for Douglas's business lunch on Friday. I arranged for fresh orchids to be delivered because Douglas insisted that successful people notice details, and wilted flowers suggest neglect. Every task on my perfectly organized to-do list was designed to support Douglas's image, to make him look more successful, more established, more trustworthy to potential clients and business partners. I was a full-time curator of his reputation, and I had been performing the role flawlessly for 3 years. But that morning, as I went through the motions of being the perfect corporate wife, I found myself really examining what my days had become. 9 a.m., I called our interior designer to discuss updating the living room. Douglas had mentioned that the current furniture was looking a bit dated, and we needed something more contemporary, more impressive for the holiday entertaining season. The designer quoted me $40,000 for a complete refresh. $40,000. For furniture, we would probably replace again in 2 years when Douglas decided our image needed another update. I approved the estimate without question, just as I always did. After all, Douglas had trained me well never to worry about money. "We're doing great financially," he'd always say when I occasionally expressed concern about our spending. "Trust me, I know what we can afford." At 10:30, I drove to the Country Club for my weekly tennis lesson with the wives of Douglas's business associates. These women were all variations of the same theme, perfectly groomed, impeccably dressed, utterly devoted to supporting their husbands' careers. We talked about charity events, vacation destinations, and the latest fashion trends, but never about anything substantial, never about our own dreams or ambitions. Today's conversation was typical. Astor Morrison, married to a prominent commercial developer, was planning a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital. "We need wives who understand presentation," she said, sipping her post-tennis smoothie. "Donors need to see that we take this seriously, that we know how to manage important events." I nodded and smiled, agreeing to help with decorations and vendor coordination. It was meaningful work, helping sick children, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my role was purely decorative. The men made the real decisions, wrote the big checks, and received the recognition. We wives were the supporting cast, making everything look beautiful and effortless. Jenny Martinez, another tennis partner and wife of a real estate attorney, mentioned casually that her husband was working on some exciting new deals with several local developers, including Douglas. "The real estate market is just booming right now," she said. "Our husbands are so clever, finding all these opportunities." I smiled and agreed, but something about her comment nagged at me. Douglas had been working longer hours lately, traveling more frequently, taking more meetings. If business was booming, if deals were closing successfully, why had he seemed so stressed and distracted? After tennis, I went to lunch at the Gallery District with two other wives, discussing an upcoming art auction where we were expected to bid on pieces for our homes. The conversation centered around which artists were trending and how certain acquisitions could enhance our husbands' reputations as sophisticated collectors. "Douglas has such excellent taste," commented Blake's wife, studying the auction catalog. "That sculpture he bought last month is absolutely stunning, very cutting edge." I thanked her for the compliment, though I privately thought the sculpture looked like twisted metal and cost more than most people's annual salaries. But Douglas had insisted it was investment art and would demonstrate our commitment to supporting emerging talent. During lunch, I excused myself to use the restroom and checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Douglas, which was unusual. He rarely called during business hours unless something urgent had come up. I called him back immediately. "Rose." His voice sounded strained, almost breathless. "I need you to cancel the dinner party this weekend." "Cancel it? But we've had this planned for months. The Hendersons are flying in specifically for—" "Something's come up," he interrupted. "A major deal opportunity. I need to focus completely on business right now. No distractions." There was that word again. Distractions. "Douglas, I can handle the dinner party myself. You don't need to be involved in the planning. You can just—" "No, Rose." His tone was sharp, almost angry. "Cancel it. Cancel everything. Social for the next few weeks. I need complete focus." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at my phone, feeling a cold knot forming in my stomach. In 3 years of marriage, Douglas had never canceled a business dinner party. These events were crucial to his networking, his relationship building, his image maintenance. Canceling meant losing face, appearing unreliable, potentially damaging important business relationships. What kind of crisis would make him willing to risk that? I returned to lunch and made polite excuses about why we needed to postpone our gathering. The other wives were understanding but curious, asking questions I couldn't answer because I didn't understand what was happening myself. The afternoon brought more strange calls. Douglas asked me to postpone our scheduled couples massage appointment. Then he asked me to cancel our subscription to the private dining club where we entertained clients monthly. Each cancellation felt like a small retreat from the social obligations that had defined our life together. By evening, I was genuinely worried. When Douglas came home, he looked haggard, older than his 41 years. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his tie askew, his shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed. "Long day?" I asked carefully, pouring him his usual scotch. He took the glass without looking at me. "You could say that. Do you want to talk about it? Maybe I can help?" "Help?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Rose, you're a wonderful wife, but this is business. Complex business. It's not something you could understand." The dismissal stung, as it always did, but this time I felt something else underneath the hurt. Anger. I had been a forensic accountant before I became his wife. I had solved complex financial puzzles professionally. I wasn't some airheaded socialite. I was an intelligent woman who had chosen to support his dreams instead of pursuing my own. But pointing that out would only lead to another lecture about how my little accounting job wasn't comparable to the high-stakes world of commercial real estate development. So I swallowed my anger, as I always did, and played my part. "Of course," I said softly. "I just want to support you however I can." He nodded absently, already pulling out his phone to make another call. I was dismissed, invisible again, just another beautiful object in our perfectly curated home. But as I went through my evening routine, preparing dinner he barely touched, tidying rooms that were already immaculate, waiting for a husband who seemed to see me only as a reflection of his own success, I felt something shifting inside me. 3 years of playing this role perfectly, and what did I have to show for it? A beautiful prison, a husband who treated me like a decorative accessory, and the growing suspicion that our perfect life was built on something far less solid than I had believed. The perfect wife routine was starting to feel less like love and more like performance art, and I was getting tired of performing. The changes in Douglas became impossible to ignore over the following weeks. What had started as occasional late nights and mysterious phone calls evolved into a pattern of behavior so erratic that even our carefully maintained social circle began to notice. It was at the Metropolitan Charity Gala 3 weeks later that I first saw Jenny Martinez in person. Douglas had been reluctant to attend the event, claiming he was too busy with critical negotiations, but I'd insisted. We had committed months earlier, purchased a table for $8,000, and invited important clients. Backing out would have been social and professional suicide. Jenny arrived with our group, introduced simply as my executive assistant who's been instrumental in our recent success. She was everything I had expected and worse, stunning in that effortless way that only comes with youth, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly household budget, and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from knowing every man in the room is looking at you. But what struck me most wasn't her beauty. It was the way Douglas transformed in her presence. The haggard, distracted man who had been coming home to me became animated, charming, almost electric. He hung on her every word, laughed at comments that weren't particularly funny, and found excuses to touch her arm during conversations. Jenny has been absolutely invaluable, he told our table mates, his hand resting possessively on the back of her chair. She's brought fresh perspectives to some challenging projects. I don't know what I'd do without her insights. I watched this. Performance with growing nausea, smiling and nodding like the supportive wife I was supposed to be while my husband essentially courted another woman in front of our friends and business associates. Jenny, for her part, played her role perfectly. She was deferential to Douglas, respectful to me, and charmingly modest about her contributions to his business. "Mr. Whitmore is an amazing mentor," she said when someone complimented her obvious intelligence. "I'm learning so much about the industry from him." The way she said Mr. Whitmore with just a hint of breathiness, the way her eyes lingered on his face when she spoke, the way she seemed to glow under his attention, it was masterfully done. If I hadn't been married to the man she was seducing, I might have admired her technique. During the auction portion of the evening, Douglas bid aggressively on a painting I had never seen him show interest in, a contemporary piece by an emerging artist that sold for $35,000. When I quietly asked him about it later, he brushed off my concern. "It's an investment," he said curtly. Jenny identified the artist as someone whose work is likely to appreciate significantly. Jenny again. Always Jenny. The ride home was silent, except for Douglas's phone buzzing constantly with text messages. Each notification made him smile in a way that twisted my stomach. When I finally worked up the courage to ask who was messaging him so late, he claimed it was international clients in different time zones. But I had caught a glimpse of one message when he carelessly left his phone face up on the car's center console. "Thank you for such a wonderful evening. You looked incredibly handsome in your tuxedo. J." That night, Douglas claimed he needed to catch up on emails and disappeared into his office again. I lay awake until nearly dawn, listening to the low murmur of his voice through the closed door, wondering who required such lengthy late-night conversations. The financial irregularities began showing up in small ways that might have been easily overlooked if I hadn't started paying attention. Credit card statements arrived with charges I didn't recognize. Expensive restaurants where Douglas claimed to be eating alone. Jewelry purchases he said were client gifts. Hotel charges in cities where he supposedly had only day meetings. When I asked about a particularly large charge at Tiffany & Co., Douglas became defensive for the first time in our marriage. "Rose, I handle our finances. You don't need to worry about every detail. That was a business expense, a closing gift for a major client." $15,000 for a closing gift? I pressed gently. That seems quite generous. His jaw tightened. In my business, maintaining relationships requires significant investments. If you had any understanding of commercial real estate, you'd know that these expenses are normal. There it was again. The casual dismissal of my intelligence, the implication that I was too simple to understand his sophisticated business world. But this time, his defensiveness seemed forced, almost panicked. I started noticing other things too. Douglas's gym membership, which he claimed was essential for staying competitive in a young person's industry, included charges for personal training sessions I had never heard him mention. His dry cleaning bills had tripled, suggesting he was changing clothes more frequently than his normal work schedule would require. Most telling were the business trips. Douglas had always traveled for work, but now these trips were longer, more frequent, and increasingly vague about their purposes. When I asked for details about a week-long investor conference in San Diego, he provided only the most general information. "Strategic planning sessions," he said dismissively. "Market analysis meetings, very technical stuff. You'd find it boring." But when I casually mentioned the conference to Blake Morrison at our country club, he looked confused. "San Diego in November? I'm not aware of any major real estate conferences there this time of year. Are you sure it wasn't the Phoenix Summit?" I assured him I must have misunderstood. But the seed of doubt was planted. The phone calls became more secretive. 2. Douglas had always taken business calls openly, often discussing deals in front of me with the assumption that I wasn't really listening or wouldn't understand the details. Now he stepped out of rooms when his phone rang, claimed calls were from confidential clients, and developed a habit of taking long walks while talking to international investors. When Lillian finally visited for our delayed coffee date, her trained psychologist's eye picked up on tensions I thought I had been hiding successfully. "You seem different," she said, studying my face across the cafe table. "Tired, stressed. Is everything okay with Douglas?" I found myself wanting to confess everything. The weird behavior, the financial irregularities, the beautiful young assistant who seemed to have captured my husband's complete attention. But loyalty, or perhaps pride, held me back. "He's just been working hard," I said instead. "Big projects, lots of pressure." Lillian didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. Instead, she asked a question that haunted me for days afterward. "Rose, when was the last time you felt genuinely happy? Not grateful? Not satisfied with your life's appearance? But actually deeply happy?" I couldn't answer her, because I honestly couldn't remember. The end came on a Thursday evening in early December, exactly 4 months after Jenny Martinez had entered our lives. I had spent the day preparing for what I thought would be a quiet dinner at home. Douglas's favorite lamb roast with rosemary potatoes, a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, candles lit throughout our dining room. I was trying to save our marriage with a home-cooked meal, though I hadn't admitted that desperation to myself yet. Douglas arrived home later than usual, which had become his norm. But something was different about his demeanor. There was a finality in his movements, a cold determination I had never seen before. He barely acknowledged the elaborate dinner I had prepared, instead pouring himself a large scotch and standing by our floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city lights. "Douglas?" I said softly, wiping my hands on my apron. "Dinner's ready. I made your favorite." He turned around, and the look in his eyes made my blood freeze. There was no warmth, no familiarity, no recognition of the 3 years we had spent, building a life together. He was looking at me like I was a stranger. Worse, like I was an obstacle. "Rose, we need to talk." Those 4 words hit me like a physical blow. In my experience, conversations that began with, "we need to talk," never ended well. "Of course," I managed, my voice surprisingly steady. "Should we sit down? I can keep dinner warm." "This can't wait." He set down his scotch and faced me fully, his expression businesslike, as if he were terminating an unsatisfactory employee. "I'm leaving." The words hung in the air between us. For a moment, I couldn't process them. Leaving for where? Another business trip? A late meeting? "I don't understand," I said, though some part of me absolutely did understand. "I'm leaving you, Rose. This marriage, this life, it's over." The candles I had lit so carefully seemed to flicker in my peripheral vision. The smell of the lamb roast that had filled our home with warmth suddenly made me nauseous. "Douglas, what are you saying? If this is about work stress, or if I've done something wrong, we can talk about it. We can fix whatever." "There's nothing to fix." His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were reading from a script he had rehearsed. "I've realized that this marriage was a mistake. We're not compatible. We want different things." I stared at him, this man I had loved, supported, and sacrificed for, and felt like I was looking at a complete stranger. "Different things? Douglas, I've given you everything. I've supported every decision you've made, every goal you've set. I gave up my career for you, my independence." "And that's exactly the problem," he interrupted, his tone sharpening with what sounded like annoyance. "You're too dependent, Rose. Too ordinary. I need someone who challenges me, who understands ambition, who can contribute to my success rather than just supporting it from the sidelines." The word ordinary hit me like a slap. It was cruel and calculated, chosen specifically to hurt. Someone like Jenny? The question escaped before I could stop it. For the first time since he'd started this conversation, Douglas looked uncomfortable, but he recovered quickly, his expression hardening. "Jenny understands the business world. She has vision, drive, intelligence that extends beyond managing social calendars and dinner parties. She's everything a successful man needs in a partner. Everything I wasn't," he meant. Everything I had apparently failed to be despite 3 years of trying to be exactly what he wanted. "So you're leaving me for your 25-year-old assistant?" I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded when inside I felt like I was dying. "I'm leaving you because we've grown apart. Because you're holding me back. Because I deserve better than comfortable." There was that word again. Comfortable. He spat it out like it was something disgusting, something shameful. 3 years, Douglas. 3 years of my life. 3 years of supporting your dreams, hosting your clients, being exactly the wife you said you wanted. "And I'm grateful for that," he said, but his tone suggested he was anything but grateful. "But gratitude isn't love, Rose, and comfortable isn't enough anymore." He was already moving toward the stairs, apparently planning to pack immediately. The casual cruelty of it, the fact that he had already decided not only to leave but to do it tonight without warning, without discussion, left me speechless. "What about our life together?" I finally managed. "Our home, our plans, our prenup is very clear about asset division," he said without turning around. "You'll be fine financially. More than fine, actually. Consider it a generous severance package for 3 years of service." Service. As if being his wife had been a job I was now being fired from. "I'll be back tomorrow to collect my things," he called down from upstairs. "I'd prefer if you weren't here." And just like that, I was dismissed from my own life. I stood in our dining room, surrounded by the remnants of the dinner I had prepared with such hope, listening to my husband pack his belongings upstairs. and felt something inside me break apart completely. But underneath the devastation, underneath the humiliation and grief, a small, cold voice in my head whispered, "You have forensic accounting skills, Rose, and you've never used them to examine your own husband's finances." Maybe it was time to start. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in our living room. My living room now, I supposed, staring at the city lights that Douglas had been gazing at just hours before when he delivered his devastating verdict on our marriage. The lamb roast sat untouched on the dining room table, the candles burned down to waxy stubs, the wine unopened. The scene looked like a shrine to foolish hope, a monument to my own naivety. Around 3 a.m, my phone buzzed with a text message. For one pathetic moment, I thought it might be Douglas, perhaps coming to his senses, realizing what he was throwing away. Instead, it was from Jenny Martinez. "I'm so sorry about everything, Rose. I hope you understand that sometimes these things just happen. No one meant for anyone to get hurt." I stared at the message, reading it over and over, trying to process the casual cruelty of it. These things just happen. As if my marriage had ended due to some unavoidable natural disaster rather than deliberate choices made by two people who had betrayed my trust. But what struck me most was the timing. Douglas had left me only hours ago, and Jenny was already reaching out with what felt like a carefully crafted message of fake sympathy. How long had they been planning this moment? How long had they been discussing the best way to handle the Rose problem? I didn't respond to her text. What was there to say? The next morning brought a parade of humiliations I hadn't anticipated. Douglas returned as promised, accompanied by Jenny to collect his belongings. He had the courtesy to call first, giving me 30 minutes to make myself scarce, as if I were the intruder in my own home. I waited in a coffee shop downstairs, watching through the windows as movers carried box after box from our building. Our furniture, our art, our carefully curated life. Apparently, much of it was being redistributed according to Douglas's preferences. When I finally returned to the penthouse 3 hours later, it looked like it had been professionally burglarized. The expensive sculpture Douglas had bought at Jenny's recommendation was gone. The Italian leather furniture from our living room had vanished. Even some of the artwork I had personally selected and paid for with my own money before our marriage had disappeared. On the kitchen counter, I found an envelope with my name written in Douglas's familiar handwriting. Inside was a check and a brief note. "Rose, this should cover your immediate expenses while we work out the formal arrangements. I've spoken with my attorney about expediting the divorce proceedings. As discussed, the prenup clearly outlines asset division. I hope we can handle this maturely and amicably. Douglas." The check was for $50,000, a generous severance package, just as he had promised, the amount that was supposed to make me grateful for 3 years of service to his ambitions. I sat in my half-empty home, holding this check, and felt a rage so pure and cold it surprised me. Not just at the money, though the casual way he had reduced our marriage to a financial transaction was devastating, but at the word maturely. Mature would have been having an honest conversation about problems in our marriage. Mature would have been couples therapy, or at least an attempt to work through whatever issues had led him to seek comfort elsewhere. Mature would have been ending our marriage before starting something with his assistant. What Douglas had done was the opposite of mature. It was cowardly, selfish, and deliberately cruel. My phone rang. My sister Lillian, calling for our weekly check-in. "Rose, how are you? You sounded a bit off when we talked last week." I opened my mouth to give my usual response. "Fine, everything's fine, just busy." But what came out instead was the truth. Douglas left me, for his 25-year-old assistant, yesterday. The silence on the other end stretched for so long I wondered if the call had dropped. "I'm getting on the next flight," Lillian finally said, her voice tight with fury. "Don't make any major decisions until I get there." Lillian, you don't need to. Yes, I do. You shouldn't be alone right now. And Rose? Her voice became gentler. I'm so sorry. I know how much you loved him. After we hung up, I walked through the rooms of our penthouse, really seeing them for the first time in years. Without Douglas's belongings, without his presence filling every space, the apartment felt different. Smaller somehow, but also lighter. In his office, the room where he had spent so many late nights taking mysterious calls and working on confidential projects, I found something he had apparently overlooked in his hurried packing. A single manila folder tucked behind a filing cabinet labeled Personal Confidential. My forensic accountant instincts, dormant for 3 years, suddenly sparked to life. I opened the folder and found bank statements for accounts I had never seen before. Credit card statements showing charges that made my stomach drop. And at the bottom, a contract with a law firm I didn't recognize for asset protection services and offshore account management. The dates on these documents went back over a year. This wasn't a recent development triggered by his affair with Jenny. Douglas had been planning his exit strategy for months, maybe longer. He hadn't just left me for another woman. He had been systematically preparing to leave me penniless while he moved on to his new life. But Douglas had made one crucial error in his calculations. He had forgotten that his ordinary wife used to be very, very good at following money trails. Lillian arrived 12 hours later, bursting through my door with the fury of a protective older sister and the analytical mind of a clinical psychologist. She took one look at my half-empty apartment and my red-rimmed eyes, and immediately went into crisis management mode. Okay, she said, setting down her overnight bag and rolling up her sleeves. First things first, have you eaten anything since yesterday? I realized I hadn't. The thought of food had been revolting since Douglas delivered his devastating news. Lillian ordered Thai takeout and force-fed me pad Thai while I gave her the full story. Douglas's increasingly strange behavior, Jenny's obvious manipulation, the cruel dismissal, and the insulting check he'd left behind. But it was when I showed her the manila folder I'd found that her expression shifted from sympathetic to suspicious. Rose, she said slowly, studying the bank statements. This doesn't look right. Look at these account numbers. They're all different from your joint accounts, aren't they? I nodded, feeling that familiar analytical excitement I hadn't experienced in 3 years. He's been moving money around, large amounts, and look at this. I pointed to a series of transfers. These deposits don't match his salary schedule. They're irregular, random amounts, and they're coming from multiple sources. Lillian, who had helped me through graduate school and knew my professional capabilities better than anyone, recognized the shift in my demeanor immediately. You want to investigate him, don't you? I need to understand what's really been happening, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Douglas didn't just wake up one day and decide to leave me for a younger woman. This has been planned, calculated. I need to know how deep this goes. What about the prenup? He seemed pretty confident about that. I pulled out our prenuptial agreement, a document I had signed trustingly 3 years ago without much scrutiny. Reading it now with my professional eye, I noticed something Douglas probably hoped I wouldn't catch. The prenup protects assets, disclosed at the time of marriage, I explained to Lillian. But if he's been hiding assets, moving money into accounts I didn't know about, or acquiring property without my knowledge, those assets might not be covered. More importantly, I was beginning to suspect that Douglas's financial activities might extend beyond simple divorce planning. The irregular deposits, the offshore account management services, the asset protection legal fees, it all suggested something much more complex and potentially illegal. What do you need? Lillian asked simply. Time and access to financial records I probably shouldn't have access to anymore. The next morning, while Lillian kept watch, I used the computer skills I'd developed as a forensic accountant to begin my investigation. Douglas, in his arrogance, had never changed our shared passwords, or removed my access to several business accounts. He probably assumed I'd never think to look, or wouldn't understand what I was seeing if I did. He was wrong on both counts. I started with the accounts I found in the hidden folder, cross-referencing them with our joint credit card statements and Douglas's business records. What I discovered made my hands shake. For the past 18 months, Douglas had been systematically siphoning money from our joint accounts and moving it into private accounts I'd never known existed. But more disturbing were the sources of income flowing into these accounts. Payments from individuals and companies I didn't recognize, often accompanied by vague descriptions like consulting fees or project management. One name appeared repeatedly: Richmond Holdings, LLC. Large payments, monthly, always for different amounts. When I tried to research Richmond Holdings, I hit a wall. It was a shell company with no apparent business operations, no employees, and an address that turned out to be a P.O. box. "Lillian," I called from Douglas's former office, my voice tight with excitement and dread. "I think I'm looking at money laundering." She appeared in the doorway immediately. "What did you find?" I showed her the pattern of transactions, the shell companies, the increasingly complex web of money moving between accounts. These aren't legitimate business transactions. Douglas has been receiving payments from unknown sources and moving the money through multiple accounts to obscure its origin. Could this be related to his real estate business? Maybe, but not legally. Look at this. I pulled up a real estate transaction from 6 months ago. Douglas sold a commercial property for $2.8 million, but the money from that sale never appeared in any of his disclosed business accounts. Instead, it went through 3 different shell companies before ending up in an offshore account. The implications were staggering. Douglas wasn't just hiding assets from me, he was potentially running an illegal operation, using his real estate business as a front for financial crimes. But the most chilling discovery came when I cross-referenced the timeline of these suspicious transactions with Douglas's relationship with Jenny. The illegal activities had accelerated dramatically after she joined his business. Either she was an unwitting accomplice, or she was actively helping him commit financial crimes. "Rose," Lillian said quietly, "you need to be very careful. If Douglas is involved in money laundering, if he's running criminal schemes, then he's not just a cheating husband. He's potentially dangerous." I looked at my sister, feeling a cold determination settle over me. Good thing I know exactly how to trace dirty money. Douglas thought he had discarded his ordinary wife. Instead, he had just unleashed the one person, with the skills and motivation to uncover every secret he'd been hiding. The investigation was just beginning. 3 days into my investigation, I uncovered something that made me physically ill. Hidden deep in Douglas's electronic files, protected by passwords I cracked using his predictable pattern of our anniversary dates and Jenny's birthday, I found the true scope of his financial deception. Douglas wasn't just hiding assets. He was drowning in debt. Massive, staggering debt that made our luxurious lifestyle a complete fantasy. The first clue came from a spreadsheet labeled Current Obligations that Douglas had clearly been using to track what he owed. As I scrolled through the entries, each number larger than the last, I felt my vision blur. Credit cards, $340,000 across 17 different accounts. Business loans, $580,000 from multiple lenders. Private loans, $720,000 from individuals whose names I didn't recognize. Offshore obligations, $650,000 listed only as international urgent. The total was breathtaking, $2.29 million in debt, but it was worse than just owing money. The dates on these obligations told a horrifying story. Many of the loans were past due, some by months. Late fees and penalties were compounding daily. Several creditors had already initiated collection proceedings. I sat back in Douglas's leather chair, staring at numbers that represented the complete financial destruction of everything I thought we had built together. Our penthouse, our cars, our furniture, our lifestyle, all of it had been purchased with borrowed money that Douglas had no realistic way to repay. "Lillian!" I called, my voice barely steady. "You need to see this." She hurried into the office, took one look at my face, and immediately sat down. "How bad is it?" $2.3 million. The number felt surreal coming out of my mouth. He owes over $2 million to creditors all over the world. Lillian was quiet for a long moment, studying the spreadsheet. "Rose, how is this even possible? You've been living like millionaires." "Because we've been spending like millionaires, using other people's money." I pulled up another file that made the situation even clearer. "Look at this. Douglas has been running what's essentially a Ponzi scheme through his real estate business. He takes money from new investors, promising them returns on property developments that don't actually exist." The fraudulent investment scheme was elaborate and sophisticated. Douglas would identify wealthy individuals seeking real estate investments, often through introductions from Jenny at social events and business gatherings. He would present them with detailed proposals for commercial developments, shopping centers, office buildings, residential complexes, complete with architectural renderings, financial projections, and fabricated permits. Investors would write checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars, believing they were buying into lucrative development projects. Instead, Douglas was using their money to pay off earlier investors, maintain his lavish lifestyle, and service the growing mountain of debt he'd accumulated. This is why Jenny was so valuable to him, I realized, pulling up email exchanges between them. She wasn't just his mistress. She was his primary recruitment tool. Look at these messages. The emails revealed Jenny's role in the scheme with disturbing clarity. She would identify potential investors at charity events, business conferences, and social gatherings, then feed their information to Douglas. Her youth, beauty, and apparent sophistication made wealthy men more willing to trust her recommendations. But the most damning evidence was a conversation thread from just 2 weeks ago, right around the time Douglas had become increasingly agitated and distracted. "Jenny, the Hendersons are asking for an update on the Harbor Point project. They want to visit the construction site." "Douglas, stall them. Tell them there are permit delays." "Jenny, Douglas, we can't keep stalling everyone. The Morrison account is also asking questions, and the Blake Investment Group wants their quarterly returns." "Douglas, I'm working on it. The new money from the Patterson deal should buy us another month." "Jenny, what happens when that runs out? We're running out of new investors and the old ones are getting suspicious." "Douglas, then we execute the exit strategy we discussed. Clean accounts, new identities, fresh start." I read those last lines 3 times before the full implications sank in. Exit strategy, clean accounts, new identities. Douglas hadn't just been planning to leave me for Jenny. He'd been planning to flee the country with her, taking whatever money they could steal and leaving behind a trail of defrauded investors and unpaid creditors. "Lillian," I said, my voice eerily calm, "I think my husband and his girlfriend were planning to disappear together, permanently." The timeline suddenly made perfect sense. Douglas's increasing paranoia, the mysterious business trips, the rush to end our marriage. He had been preparing to abandon everything and everyone, including me, to escape the consequences of his crimes. But there was something else in those files, something that made my blood run cold. A document titled "Loose Ends" with a single entry. "Rose, prenup settlement, $50K maximum exposure, $50,000. The same amount as the check he'd left me. He had calculated exactly how little he could get away with paying me, planning to leave me with virtually nothing while he and Jenny started a new life with millions in stolen money. The cruel irony was perfect. Douglas had called me ordinary, dismissed me as someone who couldn't understand his sophisticated business world. But his sophisticated business world was nothing more than an elaborate house of cards, held together by lies, theft, and the labor of his ordinary wife, who had unknowingly provided him with the perfect cover of respectability. He had underestimated me in every possible way, and now I had the evidence to destroy him completely. The deeper I dug into Douglas's files, the more I realized that his criminal enterprise was far more extensive than just investment fraud. He had built an entire network of accomplices, shell companies, and financial instruments designed to obscure the flow of dirty money. It started with a contact list I found buried in his encrypted files, over 200 names with detailed notes about their financial status, investment appetite, and personal vulnerabilities. Douglas had been systematically cataloging wealthy individuals for years, building a database of potential victims. But it wasn't just random targeting. Douglas had been using our social connections, our marriage, and my unwitting participation in his scheme to gain credibility with his marks. "Look at this," I told Lillian, pulling up a file labeled Rose Introductions. "He's been documenting every person I've ever introduced him to, every social connection I've made available to him." The list was extensive and heartbreaking. Friends from my college days, colleagues from my former accounting firm, even my own family members were listed with notes about their estimated net worth and investment potential. My sister's husband, Blake, was listed as high-value target, trust fund, looking for passive income opportunities. Douglas had been mining my relationships for 3 years, using my credibility and likability to access victims I had unknowingly delivered to him. But the network extended beyond social connections. Douglas had established business relationships with a sophisticated network of enablers. There was Jason Fitzgerald, a corrupt lawyer who helped establish shell companies and draft fraudulent contracts. Remy Torres, a financial advisor who funneled clients to Douglas's fake investment opportunities. And most disturbing of all, Aster Blackwood, a private banker who helped move money through offshore accounts and provided insider information about wealthy clients. Each accomplice received a percentage of the stolen money, creating a criminal organization that had been operating for years before I ever suspected anything was wrong. The file on Aster Blackwood was particularly revealing. She worked at Meridian Private Wealth, the same bank where Douglas and I maintained our accounts. She had been feeding him information about high-net-worth clients, helping him identify targets, and providing detailed intelligence about their financial situations. But more than that, Aster had been helping Douglas hide money in accounts I never knew existed. The asset protection services I had found earlier weren't legitimate financial planning. They were criminal conspiracy to conceal stolen funds. "Rose," Lillian said, reading over my shoulder, "this woman has access to your financial information, too. She knows everything about your accounts, your spending patterns, your assets." The implications were terrifying. Douglas's criminal network hadn't just been targeting strangers, they had been studying me, analyzing my financial behavior, preparing for the day when Douglas would need to cut me out of his life completely. I found evidence of this surveillance in a file labeled Our Monitoring. Aster had been providing monthly reports on my spending, my account balances, even my interactions with bank personnel. They knew exactly how much money I had access to, which accounts I never checked, and how they could minimize my financial recovery after Douglas disappeared. But the most chilling discovery was a series of emails between Douglas and Jason Fitzgerald, discussing spousal asset exposure and liability containment strategies. "Jason, if Rose becomes suspicious or starts asking questions, we need to ensure she can't access any accounts that might lead back to the primary operations. Douglas, she's not smart enough to piece anything together, but we should be prepared. What are our options?" Jason, standard divorce proceedings under the prenup will limit her exposure to legitimate assets only. If she somehow accesses offshore records, we can claim she obtained them illegally and invalidate any evidence. Douglas, And if she tries to go to authorities? Jason, who's going to believe the bitter ex-wife of a respected businessman? Especially if she's obtained financial records through unauthorized access? We paint her as unstable, vindictive, potentially criminal herself. Reading these exchanges, I realized that Douglas hadn't just been planning to abandon me. He had been preparing to destroy me if I ever became a threat to his operations. They had strategies in place to discredit me, criminalize my efforts to uncover the truth, and ensure that even if I suspected criminal activity, no one would believe me. But they had made one crucial error in their calculations. They had assumed I would remain the passive, trusting wife I had been for 3 years. They hadn't anticipated that betrayal might reawaken the investigative skills I had buried in service to our marriage. More importantly, they hadn't realized that as a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how to document evidence in ways that would be admissible in court, how to establish clear chains of custody, and how to build cases that prosecutors could actually win. The file I was building on Douglas's criminal network was already more comprehensive than many federal investigations. I had bank records, email communications, contract documents, and financial statements that painted a complete picture of their operations. But I also found something else that made my hands tremble as I read it: a timeline for their final exit strategy. Douglas and Jenny weren't just planning to disappear someday in the distant future. According to the documents I found, they were planning to execute their escape plan in 6 weeks. The December holidays would provide perfect cover for international travel. They had already established new identities, opened accounts in non-extradition countries, and begun transferring the remaining stolen funds to their final destination accounts. In 6 weeks, Douglas planned to vanish forever, taking millions in stolen money and leaving behind dozens of defrauded investors, unpaid creditors, and one ordinary ex-wife who was supposed to be too simple to understand what had happened to her. I looked at Lillian, feeling a cold determination settle over me like armor. "We need to move fast," I said. "They're planning to disappear in 6 weeks. What are you going to do?" I smiled for the first time since Douglas had walked out. "On me, I'm going to make sure they never get the chance." After discovering the full scope of Douglas's criminal network and their 6-week timeline for escape, I knew I couldn't approach this like a traditional investigation. Going to the authorities immediately might spook them into accelerating their timeline, and I had learned enough about their contingency plans to know they were prepared for that possibility. I needed to be smarter, more strategic. I needed to become someone Douglas would never expect me to be. "Lillian," I said, closing the laptop and turning to face my sister, "I need your help with something that might sound completely insane. More insane than discovering your husband is running a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise with his 25-year-old girlfriend. I need to go undercover, not with law enforcement, on my own. I need to infiltrate their network and get evidence of active crimes, not just historical ones." Lillian stared at me for a long moment. "Rose, that's incredibly dangerous. These people have already shown they're willing to destroy you if you become a threat. If they realize what you're doing, they won't realize it because they fundamentally underestimate me. Douglas spent 3 years convincing me I was ordinary, unremarkable, intellectually inferior. That's going to be his downfall." I had been thinking about this all night, lying awake in our empty bedroom, planning. Douglas's network operated in the same social circles where I had spent 3 years playing the perfect corporate wife. I knew these people, understood their weaknesses, and had skills they didn't know I possessed. "What exactly are you proposing?" Lillian asked carefully. "I'm going to become someone completely different. Someone with money to invest, someone they would want to target. I'm going to make them come to me." The plan that had been forming in my mind was audacious, but it played to every advantage I had. I would create a new identity, not illegal documents, but a carefully constructed persona backed by real financial resources. I had skills, connections, and most importantly, inside knowledge of exactly how their operation worked. First, I would liquidate every asset I could access legally. The jewelry Douglas had bought me over the years was worth over $200,000. My car was paid off and worth another $80,000. I had personal savings accounts Douglas didn't know about, money I had saved from my freelance work during our marriage. Combined with the money I could borrow against my inheritance from my grandmother, I could put together nearly $500,000 in liquid capital. "You want to use your own money as bait?" Lillian said, horrified. "I want to use my money as an investment in justice. Besides, I'll be getting it back with interest when we seize their assets." But money was only part of the transformation. I needed to become someone Douglas wouldn't recognize, someone who moved in adjacent social circles but wasn't connected to his past. I needed to be sophisticated enough to attract their attention, but naive enough that they wouldn't suspect I was investigating them. I called my old college roommate, Maggie Chen, who now worked as a high-end image consultant in Manhattan. When I explained that I needed a complete makeover for personal reasons related to my divorce, she didn't ask questions. "How complete are we talking?" she asked. "I need to look like someone who inherited money and doesn't quite know what to do with it. Old money family, but I've been living quietly until now. Think sophisticated but slightly inexperienced with investments." Maggie understood immediately. "Ah, the wealthy widow looking to diversify. Classic target demographic for investment scams. When do we start?" 3 days later, I was sitting in Maggie's studio, watching my old self disappear. My naturally auburn hair became a rich blonde. My conservative style transformed into something more elegant, but with subtle touches that suggested new money. Slightly too flashy jewelry, designer clothes that were expensive but not quite classic. But the most important change was behavioral. I practiced a new way of speaking, slightly more breathless and enthusiastic. I created a backstory about recently inheriting a trust fund and feeling overwhelmed by suddenly having serious money to manage. I studied investment terminology just enough to sound interested, but not knowledgeable. The identity I created was perfect. Charlotte Winters, recently divorced from a tech executive, living off a substantial settlement and looking for investment opportunities that would allow her to maintain her lifestyle without working. I opened new social media accounts, established a credit history under the name, and even rented a high-end apartment in a building where Douglas's network was known to scout for clients. Charlotte Winters had to be findable, attractive to their operation, but not connected to Rose Whitmore in any obvious way. "This is incredibly elaborate," Lillian observed, watching me practice Charlotte's signature. "What if it doesn't work?" "It will work because I understand their psychology perfectly. They target people exactly like Charlotte, women with money, but not sophistication, people who want to believe they can get rich quick without understanding the risks." The final piece of my transformation was the hardest. I had to train myself to act vulnerable, naive, trusting. Everything Douglas had trained me not to be during our marriage. But I had one advantage they couldn't anticipate. I knew exactly how their scam worked, which meant I could be the perfect victim while documenting everything they did. Within 2 weeks, Charlotte Winters would be ready to make her debut in the social circles where Douglas and Jenny hunted for their prey. They thought they were playing a game where they held all the advantages. They were about to discover they had been playing against someone who knew all their moves before they made them. Charlotte Winters made her debut at the Metropolitan Arts Foundation Gala 3 weeks after my transformation began. I had chosen the event carefully. It was exactly the type of high-end charity function where Douglas and Jenny typically hunted for wealthy, socially conscious investors who might be interested in socially responsible development projects. I arrived fashionably late, wearing a stunning emerald cocktail dress that cost more than most people's rent, but looked like something someone with new money might choose. Beautiful but slightly too attention-grabbing for old money tastes. My Blonde hair was styled in loose waves, and I wore just enough jewelry to suggest wealth without displaying genuine sophistication. The persona I had created for Charlotte was working perfectly. Within minutes of arriving, I was approached by 3 different men offering to explain the auction items, fetch me drinks, or introduce me to interesting people. I played my role flawlessly, grateful for the attention, slightly overwhelmed by the social dynamics, clearly wealthy but uncertain about how to navigate these circles. "You seem a bit lost," said a familiar voice behind me. I turned to find Jason Fitzgerald, Douglas's corrupt lawyer, smiling at me with the practiced charm of a predator who had spotted promising prey. "Oh, is it that obvious?" I laughed, allowing a hint of embarrassment to color my voice. "I'm still getting used to these events. Charlotte Winters." I extended my hand with the slightly eager enthusiasm I had practiced. "Jason Fitzgerald," he replied, holding my hand a moment longer than necessary. "And you're absolutely right to feel overwhelmed. These events can be intimidating until you find your tribe. May I ask what brings you to support the Arts Foundation?" I launched into Charlotte's carefully crafted backstory. Recent divorce settlement. Wanting to use my newfound financial freedom to support meaningful causes. Feeling overwhelmed by investment advisors who all seem to want to put my money into boring stocks and bonds. Jason's eyes lit up with interest. "You know, I work with several clients who've found tremendous satisfaction in alternative investments, particularly in development projects that create both financial returns and positive community impact." "That sounds fascinating," I gushed, playing perfectly into his hands. "I've been looking for something more meaningful than just traditional investments." "Well, I happen to know someone who specializes in exactly that type of opportunity. He's actually here tonight with his business partner. Would you like me to introduce you?" My heart rate spiked, but I kept Charlotte's eager expression in place. "That would be wonderful." Jason guided me across the crowded ballroom, and I spotted them before he did. Douglas and Jenny, working the room with the practiced efficiency of seasoned con artists. Douglas looked handsome and successful in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, while Jenny was stunning in a wine-colored gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. They were talking to an elderly couple I recognized as the Pattersons, wealthy philanthropists who had been mentioned in Douglas's target files. I watched Jenny work her magic, charming the husband while Douglas impressed the wife with talk of sustainable development and guaranteed returns that also benefit the community. "Douglas, Jenny," Jason called as we approached. "I'd like you to meet Charlotte Winters. She's looking for investment opportunities with social impact." The moment Douglas's eyes met mine, I held my breath. For a terrifying second, I thought, he might recognize something familiar in my face despite the dramatic change in appearance. But his gaze moved past me with the dismissive assessment of a man evaluating a potential target. "Charlotte," Douglas said, extending his hand with his most charming smile. "Douglas Whitmore. Jason tells me you're interested in socially conscious investing." "Very much so," I replied, allowing Charlotte's breathless enthusiasm to bubble over. "I came into some money recently, divorce settlement, and I want to do something meaningful with it rather than just letting it sit in boring savings accounts." Jenny stepped forward with a warm, sisterly smile. "Oh, I completely understand. There's something so empowering about taking control of your financial future, especially after a difficult life change." The irony was exquisite. Jenny was offering me sympathy for the exact situation she and Douglas had put me in, while Douglas was already calculating how much money he could steal from me. "What kind of numbers are we talking about?" Douglas asked, his businessman's directness making the question seem natural rather than predatory. "Well," I said, lowering my voice conspiratorially, "I have about 800,000 available for investment right now, with potentially more if the returns are as good as people say they can be." I watched greed flicker in Douglas's eyes. 800,000 was exactly the right amount, large enough to make him salivate. but not so large that he'd be suspicious of why someone with that much money would need his help. "That's a significant portfolio," he said smoothly. "We'd want to be very careful about placing it in the right opportunities. Jenny and I work exclusively with select clients on development projects that typically return 15 to 20% annually." "Is that typical?" I asked with Charlotte's naive eagerness. "My divorce attorney told me to expect maybe 4 or 5% from traditional investments." "Traditional investments are for traditional thinkers," Jenny said with a conspiratorial wink. "We work with clients who want to do better than traditional." Douglas pulled out his business card, pressing it into my hand with a practiced gesture. "Why don't we schedule a meeting? I'd love to show you some of the projects we're currently developing. I think you'd be impressed by both the financial potential and the community impact." "That sounds perfect," I said, clutching his card like it was a winning lottery ticket. As I walked away from them, my heart pounding with adrenaline and vindication, I heard Jenny say to Douglas, "She's perfect. Exactly what we need right now." They had no idea how perfect this was going to be. For me. The meeting with Douglas and Jenny was scheduled for the following Thursday at Douglas's office, the same gleaming downtown space where I had attended countless client dinners as his supportive wife. Now I would be walking through those doors as Charlotte Winters, a wealthy mark they intended to defraud. I spent 3 days preparing for the performance of my life. Charlotte needed to be enthusiastic but not suspicious, wealthy but not sophisticated, trusting but not completely naive. The balance had to be perfect. Too eager, and they might suspect a setup. Too cautious, and they might look for easier targets. On Thursday morning, I dressed carefully in a designer suit that screamed, "New money," trying to look professional. I carried a leather portfolio that contained fabricated financial statements showing Charlotte's assets, along with a hidden recording device that would capture every word of their fraudulent sales pitch. The moment I walked into Douglas's office, memories flooded back. The mahogany desk where he used to review confidential contracts, the wall of awards and certifications that I now knew were mostly meaningless, the expensive artwork that had been purchased with stolen money. Being in this space as an adversary rather than a supporter felt surreal and empowering. "Charlotte!" Douglas stood up with his most charming smile, the same one that had once made me feel like the luckiest woman in the world. "Thank you so much for coming in. I think you're going to be very excited about what we have to show you." Jenny rose from the conference table, looking professional in a navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "We've put together a presentation specifically tailored to your interests and investment timeline." They had clearly done their homework on Charlotte Winters. Douglas began by outlining several exclusive development opportunities that were supposedly only available to select investors. He showed me architectural renderings of shopping centers, residential complexes, and office buildings that looked impressive, but which I knew from my investigation were completely fabricated. "This particular project," Douglas said, pointing to a gleaming office complex on his laptop screen, "is projected to break ground next month. We're still accepting investors for the final phases, but only from clients who can commit to substantial positions." "How substantial?" I asked with Charlotte's breathless interest. "We typically require a minimum investment of $250,000 for projects of this caliber," Jenny said smoothly. "It ensures that our investor pool consists of serious participants who understand the value of what we're offering." I watched them work with professional admiration. They were very good at this. Polished, convincing, armed with impressive presentations and carefully crafted financial projections. If I hadn't known it was all lies, I might have been tempted to invest myself. Douglas leaned forward confidentially. "Charlotte, I'm going to be honest with you. Most investment advisors will tell you to diversify into traditional stocks and bonds. They'll promise you 5 or 6% returns if you're lucky. But those advisors work for big firms that prioritize safety over opportunity. We work differently," Jenny added. We identify exceptional opportunities before they become available to the general market. Our clients typically see returns of 15 to 20% annually because we're willing to take calculated risks that traditional advisors won't. Consider 20%? I let my voice carry Charlotte's amazed excitement. That's incredible. But is it safe? All investing involves some risk, Douglas said with practiced sincerity. But we mitigate that risk through careful due diligence and selective project partnerships. The developments we invest in are backed by established construction companies, approved by local governments, and pre-sold to anchor tenants. Every word was a lie, delivered with the confidence of a master manipulator. I nodded enthusiastically, while making mental notes of each fraudulent claim for the recording device hidden in my portfolio. The other advantage, Jenny said, is that these investments allow you to be part of something meaningful. These aren't just financial transactions. They're community development projects that create jobs, provide housing, and contribute to economic growth. The appeal to social consciousness was particularly disgusting, considering they were stealing money that could have actually helped communities if invested legitimately. Douglas pulled out a contract. If this is something you'd like to explore, we can start with a smaller position to help you get comfortable with our process. Perhaps a $150,000 investment in our Harbor Point residential development? Harbor Point? I asked, recognizing the name from their internal communications. That sounds lovely. It's going to be a luxury townhouse community, about 30 minutes from downtown, Jenny explained enthusiastically. Pre-construction pricing, established builder, already 50% pre-sold to qualified buyers. I knew from my investigation that Harbor Point didn't exist beyond some stock photos and a fake website they had created. Any money I invested would go directly into their personal accounts and offshore escape funds. I'm very interested, I said, letting Charlotte's excitement bubble over. This is exactly the kind of opportunity I was hoping to find. Douglas smiled with satisfaction. Excellent. Jenny can walk you through the paperwork, and we can have your funds transferred by early next week. Actually, I said, I'd prefer to review everything with my attorney first. I know it's probably unnecessary, but my divorce lawyer made me promise not to sign anything without legal review. For just a moment, I saw irritation flicker across Douglas's face. They preferred clients who signed immediately, before having time to think or seek advice. But Jenny recovered smoothly. Of course, she said. That's actually very smart. Take all the time you need to feel comfortable. They had no idea that my attorney was actually a federal prosecutor who specialized in financial crimes, or that Charlotte Winters had just given them enough rope to hang themselves. I had the evidence I needed, but I wanted more than just criminal convictions. I wanted Douglas and Jenny to understand exactly how thoroughly they had been outplayed, and I wanted to see their faces when they realized that their ordinary victim had been 3 steps ahead of them the entire time. So I scheduled a second meeting, ostensibly to finalize Charlotte's investment in the Harbor Point development. But this time, I came prepared for a very different kind of conversation. The meeting was set for Friday afternoon at Douglas's office. I arrived as Charlotte Winters one last time, carrying a briefcase that contained not just the fabricated investment documents they expected, but comprehensive evidence of their entire criminal operation. "Charlotte!" Jenny greeted me with her practiced warmth. "We're so excited to officially welcome you to our investor family." Douglas stood behind his desk with that confident smile I had once found so attractive. "I think you're going to be very happy with this decision. Harbor Point is going to be one of our most successful developments." I sat down across from them, setting my briefcase carefully on the floor beside my chair. "Actually, before we finalize anything, I have some questions about your other developments. I've been doing some research, and I'm curious about a few things." "Of course," Douglas said smoothly. "What would you like to know?" I pulled out a folder from my briefcase. Not the investment documents they expected, but bank statements showing the flow of money through their shell companies. I'm wondering about Richmond Holdings, LLC. It seems to be involved in several of your projects, but I can't find any information about their actual development activities. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate. Douglas's smile faltered slightly while Jenny's eyes sharpened with sudden alertness. I'm not sure where you got those documents, Douglas said carefully, but investor financial information is typically confidential. Oh, these aren't investor documents, I interrupted, pulling out more papers. These are records of money laundering activities. Quite extensive ones, actually. Jenny started to stand up, but I continued talking, my voice growing stronger and more authoritative with each word. For instance, this transaction from 6 months ago, $2.8 million from the supposed sale of the Riverside Commercial Plaza, routed through 3 shell companies before ending up in an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Douglas had gone very still, his businessman's instincts recognizing danger even if he couldn't quite identify its source yet. The interesting thing, I continued, spreading more documents across his desk, is that the Riverside Commercial Plaza was never actually sold. The sale documents were forged, the buyer was fictitious, and the money came directly from investor funds that were supposed to be developing the Harbor Point project. "Who are you?" Jenny whispered, backing toward the door. I smiled, feeling a cold satisfaction I hadn't expected. I'm someone who understands forensic accounting much better than you anticipated. Douglas's face had gone white. Charlotte, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Actually, there hasn't been any misunderstanding at all. I know exactly who you are, Douglas Whitmore. I know about your $2.3 million in debt, your Ponzi scheme, and your plan to disappear to a non-extradition country with stolen investor funds. I stood up slowly, pulling out the final piece of evidence that would make my identity unmistakably clear. A copy of our marriage certificate with my real name clearly visible. "Hello, darling," I said, dropping Charlotte's breathless voice for my own natural tone. "Did you miss me?" Douglas stared at the marriage certificate, then at my face, his expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally pure terror. "Rose? But how? You look completely different." "Amazing what? Professional styling can accomplish. Though I suppose you would know about creating false appearances." Jenny had pressed herself against the wall, her face pale with shock. "You're his ex-wife? But you invested money. You signed contracts." "I documented crimes," I corrected. "Every conversation we've had has been recorded. Every fraudulent claim you've made has been preserved as evidence. The FBI has been building their case against you for weeks, using information I provided." Douglas slumped into his chair, the full implications finally hitting him. "How long have you known?" "About your affair with Jenny." "Months." "About your criminal activities?" "Since the day after you left me, when I found the financial records you forgot to take with you." I leaned forward, placing my hands on his desk. The same desk where he had once told me I was too ordinary to understand his business. "You see, Douglas, you made one crucial error in your calculations. You assumed that because I played the role of supportive wife so well, that's all I was capable of being. But you forgot something important about your ordinary wife," I continued, my voice growing colder. "I used to be a forensic accountant, a very good one, and you've just spent the last month confessing to financial crimes in front of someone who knows exactly how to document evidence for federal prosecution." The office fell silent, except for the sound of Jenny's rapid breathing and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. "The FBI will be here in approximately 10 minutes, I said, checking my watch. "I'd suggest you use that time to call your lawyers. You're going to need them." Douglas looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. Complete, devastating. "Defeat. How?" he whispered. I smiled, picking up my briefcase and walking toward the door. "You underestimated the wrong woman, Douglas. That's going to cost you everything." The FBI agents arrived exactly when I had promised they would. I watched from the building's lobby as Special Agent Rebecca Torres led a team of federal investigators through the gleaming corporate entrance of Douglas's office building, carrying boxes of evidence and armed with warrants that would freeze every account, seize every asset, and unravel every thread of the criminal network I had spent weeks mapping. Agent Torres had been my primary contact throughout the investigation. When I first approached the FBI with evidence of Douglas's crimes, she had been skeptical, another bitter ex-wife making accusations against her successful husband. But when I presented her with meticulously documented financial records, recorded conversations, and a complete organizational chart of the criminal network, her skepticism transformed into professional admiration. "Mrs. Whitmore," she had told me after reviewing my evidence, "this is some of the most comprehensive financial crime documentation I've seen in 15 years of federal investigations. You've essentially done our job for us." Now, watching her team execute the coordinated raids I had helped plan, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced during my marriage. This was justice, systematic and thorough, built on evidence that could not be disputed or deflected. My phone buzzed with updates from Agent Torres as the operation unfolded. Douglas's office, secured, computers seized, files confiscated. Jenny's apartment, searched, additional financial records recovered. Jason Fitzgerald's law firm, raided simultaneously, preventing any attempt to destroy evidence. Astor Blackwood's bank office, frozen, client records preserved. The network I had identified was being dismantled piece by piece, each arrest preventing the others from fleeing or covering their tracks. But the most satisfying update came an hour later. Offshore accounts frozen. Total recovered assets, $4.2 million. They had been planning to escape with stolen money, leaving behind devastated investors and a trail of financial destruction. Instead, every dollar they had stolen was being preserved for eventual return to their victims. I thought about the elderly Patterson couple who had nearly invested their retirement savings in Douglas's fake Harbor Point development, about the Morrison family, who had trusted Jenny's youthful enthusiasm and Douglas's polished presentations, about dozens of other potential victims who would never know how close they had come to losing everything. The preliminary charges were extensive: wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, securities fraud, racketeering. Agent Torres explained that Douglas and Jenny were looking at federal sentences of 15 to 20 years each, with no possibility of early parole. "The evidence you provided makes this case essentially prosecution-proof," she told me during our debriefing. "They'll probably plead guilty to avoid trial, which means lengthy prison sentences and complete asset forfeiture." Jason Fitzgerald, facing disbarment and federal charges, had already begun cooperating with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. Astor Blackwood, whose banking career was now over, was providing detailed information about other clients who might be running similar schemes. The ripple effects extended far beyond Douglas's immediate network. His investor database led to investigations of other financial crimes. His shell company structures revealed additional money laundering operations, and his methods provided insights that would help prevent similar scams. But for me, the most important outcome was personal. The prenuptial agreement that Douglas had been so confident about was invalidated due to his failure to disclose assets and his criminal activities during our marriage. The court awarded me not just the legitimate assets I was entitled to, but substantial damages for fraud and emotional distress. More importantly, I had recovered something I hadn't fully realized I had lost during our marriage: my sense of my own competence, my professional identity, my confidence in my own judgment. Douglas had called me ordinary, dismissed my intelligence, convinced me that my value lay only in supporting his success. But when confronted with his betrayal, I had proven myself to be anything but ordinary. I had outplayed a sophisticated criminal at his own game, using skills he had convinced me to abandon and intelligence he had trained me to hide. The transformation from victim to victor was complete, and I was just getting started. The most devastating blow to Douglas's criminal empire came not from federal investigators, but from the people he had trusted most. Within 48 hours of the arrests, his carefully constructed network of accomplices began turning against each other in spectacular fashion. Jenny was the first to break. Faced with federal charges that could send her to prison for decades, she quickly realized that her loyalty to Douglas was worth considerably less than her freedom. Through her attorney, she reached out to prosecutors with an offer to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. "She's providing everything," Agent Torres told me during one of our regular updates. Bank records, communication logs, detailed information about their escape plan. Apparently, she kept meticulous records of their criminal activities. The irony was perfect. Jenny's organizational skills, which had made her so valuable to Douglas's operation, were now providing prosecutors with a roadmap to every crime they had committed together. But Jenny's cooperation came with a revelation that shocked even me. She hadn't been just a willing accomplice. She had been documenting Douglas's crimes for months, apparently planning her own exit strategy. She was planning to blackmail him, Agent Torres explained. She had evidence of his financial crimes going back years, long before their romantic relationship began. The affair might have been genuine, but she was also positioning herself to take control of his operation. The woman Douglas thought he was manipulating had been manipulating him in return. It was a betrayal within a betrayal, and I found myself almost admiring Jenny's calculated ruthlessness. Jason Fitzgerald's cooperation was even more damaging. As Douglas's attorney, he had detailed knowledge of the legal structures that supported their criminal enterprise. But more importantly, he had records of similar schemes involving other clients. Fitzgerald ran what was essentially a criminal law firm, Agent Torres told me. Douglas wasn't his only client involved in financial fraud. We're looking at potentially dozens of additional cases. Jason's cooperation led to a cascade of additional arrests as other members of his criminal clientele were exposed. Each new arrest provided more evidence against Douglas, painting a picture of a man who wasn't just running isolated scams, but was part of a broader criminal ecosystem. Astor Blackwood's betrayal was perhaps the most comprehensive. As a private banker, she had facilitated not just Douglas's crimes, but those of numerous other clients. Her cooperation with federal investigators provided access to financial records that revealed money laundering operations spanning multiple states and several countries. She kept backups of everything, Agent Torres explained with professional admiration. Every illegal transaction, every forged document, every client communication. It's like she was building an insurance policy against her own clients. The banking records Astor provided revealed the true scope of Douglas's operation. What I had initially discovered as a $2.3 million debt was actually part of a much larger scheme involving over $15 million in stolen investor funds spanning nearly 5 years. But the most satisfying aspect of these betrayals was watching Douglas realize that his supposed allies had never been loyal to him at all. Through recordings of his prison calls, I learned that he was frantically trying to understand how his trusted associates could turn against him so quickly. "He keeps talking about loyalty and honor," Agent Torres said with dark amusement. "As if there's some code of ethics among financial criminals." The man who had built his success on manipulation and betrayal was discovering what it felt like to be completely alone, abandoned by everyone he had trusted, facing the consequences of his actions without allies or protection. Meanwhile, each new piece of evidence his former accomplices provided strengthened the case against him and increased the likelihood of maximum prison sentences. Douglas had always prided himself on being a master manipulator, someone who could convince people to act against their own interests. But when faced with federal prosecution, His network of accomplices had proven they were just as calculating and self-serving as he was. The criminal empire he had spent years building was collapsing from within, destroyed by the same greed and betrayal that had created it, and I had the best seat in the house to watch it all fall apart. 6 months after Douglas walked out of our penthouse calling me ordinary, he sat in federal court wearing an orange jumpsuit, listening to a judge sentence him to 18 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. I watched from the gallery as the man who had once commanded boardrooms and charmed investors was reduced to a number in the federal prison system. The sentencing hearing was a masterclass in complete and utter destruction. Prosecutor Michelle Santos methodically outlined the scope of Douglas's crimes, victim by victim, dollar by dollar. The evidence I had helped gather painted a picture of a man who had systematically destroyed lives for personal gain. Mr. Whitmore operated a sophisticated, criminal enterprise that defrauded investors of over $15 million, Prosecutor Santos told the court. His crimes were not opportunistic or impulsive. They were calculated, deliberate, and devastating to his victims. One by one, Douglas's victims gave impact statements that reduced the courtroom to silence. Elderly couples who had lost their retirement savings, young families who had invested their children's college funds, small business owners who had trusted Douglas with money meant to expand their operations. Margaret Patterson, the elderly woman I had watched Douglas charm at the charity gala, stood with trembling hands and described how his fraud had forced her to sell her family home. "We trusted him because he seemed so successful, so professional," she said, her voice breaking. "We thought we were investing in our grandchildren's future." I watched Douglas's face throughout these testimonies, looking for any sign of remorse or recognition of the pain he had caused. Instead, I saw only the sullen resentment of a man who still believed he was the victim of circumstances, rather than the architect of deliberate cruelty. Jenny received a more lenient sentence, 8 years, in exchange for her cooperation, but her life was equally destroyed. Her MBA was worthless, her career prospects obliterated, her future reduced to whatever job she might find after federal prison with a felony conviction on her record. But the most satisfying moment came when Judge Harrison addressed Douglas directly before pronouncing sentence. "Mr. Whitmore, you have shown this court a level of arrogance and entitlement that is breathtaking in its scope," the judge said. "You stole from people who trusted you, destroyed families who believed in you, and showed no remorse for the devastation you caused. Your crimes were motivated purely by greed and a belief that you were entitled to other people's money." The judge paused, looking directly at Douglas. "You particularly exploited the trust of your own wife, using her social connections and reputation to access victims while systematically stealing from your shared life. The level of personal betrayal involved in your crimes demonstrates a character devoid of basic human decency." When the judge announced the 18-year sentence, Douglas's shoulders sagged in final defeat. There would be no appeals, no early release, no escape from the consequences of his actions. He would be nearly 60 years old when he was released, his prime years consumed by federal prison. Jason Fitzgerald received 12 years and permanent disbarment. Aster Blackwood got 10 years and the destruction of her banking career. The entire network that had enabled Douglas's crimes was systematically dismantled, each member facing consequences proportionate to their participation. But beyond the prison sentences, there was the complete social and financial destruction. Douglas's business was liquidated, his assets seized, his reputation permanently destroyed. The man who had once been featured in business magazines as a rising star in commercial real estate would never work in finance again. The penthouse where he had dismissed me as ordinary was sold to pay restitution to his victims. The cars, the artwork, the expensive lifestyle, all of it was auctioned off to recover stolen money. Most importantly, every dollar that could be recovered was returned to the people Douglas had defrauded. While not every victim was made completely whole, The comprehensive investigation I had initiated ensured that maximum restitution was achieved. As I left the courthouse that day, watching Douglas being led away in shackles, I felt a closure I hadn't expected. The man who had called me too ordinary for his success had been brought down by exactly the skills and intelligence he had dismissed. Justice, it turned out, was anything but ordinary. 2 years after Douglas's sentencing, I stood in the conference room of my own forensic accounting firm, looking out at the city skyline through windows of an office I had built with my own skills and determination. The brass nameplate on my desk read Rose Whitmore, CPA, CFE, the same name Douglas had dismissed, now representing a business that had become one of the most respected financial investigation firms in the state. My transformation from victim to victor was complete, but it had evolved into something I never expected, a mission to help others who had been betrayed by people they trusted. "Mrs. Whitmore," my assistant announced through the intercom, "your 3 o'clock appointment is here, Mrs. Jenkins, regarding her husband's suspicious business activities." I smiled, recognizing the familiar pattern. Another woman who had been financially betrayed, who needed someone to help her uncover the truth and fight back. My firm had handled dozens of similar cases, using the same investigative techniques that had brought down Douglas's criminal empire. The business had grown beyond my wildest expectations. What started as a small practice specializing in divorce-related financial investigations had expanded to handle corporate fraud, embezzlement cases, and complex money laundering schemes. My experience with Douglas's case had given me insights that few other forensic accountants possessed. But the most satisfying aspect wasn't the professional success. It was the letters I received from clients whose lives had been saved by our investigations. Women who had discovered hidden assets before their husbands could steal them. Investors who had been warned away from fraudulent schemes. Families who had recovered money they thought was lost forever. My sister Lillian often joked that I had found my true calling through the worst experience of my life. She wasn't wrong. The skills Douglas had convinced me to abandon had become the foundation for a career more fulfilling than anything I had experienced as his wife. Last week, I received an unexpected letter from Jenny Martinez. She was serving her sentence at a federal facility in Pennsylvania, and she had written to express her genuine remorse for the role she had played in destroying my marriage and defrauding investors. "I know this doesn't change anything," she wrote, "but I want you to know that watching you fight back taught me something about real strength. You showed me what integrity looks like." I had written back, not to forgive, but to acknowledge that people could change, even after making terrible choices. As for Douglas, I heard occasionally through legal channels that he was struggling with prison life. The man who had once commanded respect and fear in business circles was now just another inmate, serving out his sentence in obscurity. Sometimes people asked if I felt vindicated, if seeing him imprisoned had given me the satisfaction I sought. The answer was complicated. Justice had been served, consequences had been faced, and victims had been compensated. But my real satisfaction came from building something positive from the wreckage of our marriage. I had proved that ordinary women could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept the limitations others placed on them. And that was a victory worth more than any revenge could ever be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.